Good morning, everyone. Welcome to ODI, and also welcome to the online viewers to this meeting on how to jumpstart developing economies. I'm very pleased to say that Justin Lin is here to discuss two books that he has co-authored. And so one book is called Beating the Odds, Jumpstarting Developing Economies, and he's written that with Celestine Monga, who is now the chief economist at the African Development Bank. And the other book is Going Beyond Aid, Development Cooperation for Structural Transformation. And I think that both of these books are really, really interesting, providing a sort of a new, fresh narrative around economic transformation and how to support it. So Beating the Odds discusses how poor countries can master the art of performing economic miracles, which is that despite the sort of poor preconditions, every country can still develop as long as they do the right thing. And so we're going to discuss a bit about what that is, what the right thing is. And it isn't necessarily the answers that we thought were the case maybe 10 years ago, which was every country needs to have good governance and all the right preconditions need to be in place, infrastructure needs to be in place or everything. It's actually that every country can do it, can start from where it is and develop and can grow. And it's very much about engaging in the process of structural transformation, and that's what we're going to talk about a lot, I think. So it's about overcoming market and government failures, engaging in the process of technological upgrading, and it's about strategic industrial policies. And this book about beating the odds has a strong narrative around supporting special economic zones, for example. And it's also about a pragmatic approach to development. For example, the strong emphasis in China on developing special economic zones actually, as the book explains, comes from thinking around what had happened in Ireland and in Singapore. In the book Going Beyond Aid, Justin Lin and his co-author discuss a number of challenges with the traditional aid approach and suggest a number of ways in which China's experience offers some of the answers. So there are sort of mismatches between the traditional donor interests and recipient interests. There wasn't the focus on structural transformation, and also the sort of the ODA definition of aid is seen to be quite narrow. So we're going to talk around also what Justin thinks is the right approach to supporting the efforts of developing countries to transform their economies. The discussant is Melinda Bohannon, and she's the Deputy Director for Growth and Resilience at the Department for International Development. And under her watch, DFID developed the first ever economic development strategy that was launched in January. We'll hear more on that. And what I think is the case is that it does take some of these things into account, actually, which is a useful step going forward. Now, our program, the program that I lead, called Supporting Economic Transformation, is also working on these issues. So we have just come back from Kenya, for example, thinking around economic transformation in Kenya, industrialization, and I was also able to visit the work that Team EA, Trademark East Africa, were doing, funded by the Department for International Development, around the work in the port, for example, and how the increased efficiencies in the port, but also the work that they're thinking of around special economic zones, and including the work that China has been doing in Kenya around, for example, the railways, also thinking about special economic zones. All those things together are actually sort of examples of how support outside support can help countries transform their economies. And there are some fascinating achievements that for example, the Trademark East Africa has been able to contribute to a reduction in in transit times from the port of Mombasa in Kenya to Uganda from 18 days to 5 days. So it's much more efficient now to transport goods. Okay, so this meeting will be on the record, and the question and answers can also come through the iPad as well. And so I'd like now to introduce Justin Lin. So he's the former chief economist at the World Bank. He's director at the Center for New Structural Economics. He's a dean of the Institute of South-South Cooperation and Development and the honorary dean at the National School of Development at Peking University. He's also on the advisory group of the Supporting Economic Transformation Program. So over to you to discuss these fine books. These are excellent books.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to the seminar for my 2 books. And I want to start with why we should go beyond traditional aid and concessional borrowing. And then I'd like to provide a theoretical foundation for the rethinking for my argument. Then look into the new sources for development financing, mostly from China and other BRIC countries. Then I'd like to discuss the window of opportunities to capture the ways for structural transformation, industrialization in a very pragmatic way, which I discuss in the book, Between the Arts. Then a short concluding remarks. Among nearly 200 developing countries that emerged after the Second World War, certainly all the developing countries, they have the aspiration to be industrialized, to catch up high-income countries. But so far, the performance is quite disappointing, because among the 200 developing economies, at the time, the post-World War II. But so far, only 2 moved from low income to high income. One was Korea, the other one was Taiwan, China. And the mainland China likely to be the 3rd one by the time of 2025, to move from low income to high income. And in the 1960s, there were 101 developing and middle income economies. By the time of 2008, only 13 moved up to the high income. And among those 13, 8 were European countries surrounding Western Europe. Their income gap was small to begin with, or oil-producing countries. The other 5 were Japan and 4 small East Asian tigers. So that means that in spite of broader effort, most developing countries has been trapped in low-income status or middle-income status. And so how to improve this situation to help the low-income country to grow, to create jobs, would be essential for achieving the SDG by the time of 2030. And the nature of modern economic growth is not so hard to understand. Certainly, the modern economic growth appeared after the Industrial Revolution. And some countries, their income increased dramatically after that. And the possibility for that was because there was a continuous structural transformation in terms of technological innovation and industrial upgrading, which raised labor productivity. So it's possible to increase the income. But at the same time, also a process of continuous structural transformation in terms of hard infrastructure as well as soft institution, which reduce the transaction cost. That is the structural transformation that accompanies the possibility to raise income in the modern times. And the reason why most developing countries, they could not have a substantial increase their income was because of they don't have this type of structural transformation. Because if you go to a poor country in Africa or in other part of the world, you can see they still rely mainly on agricultural or natural resources for their livings. And that was the reason why they cannot get out of this kind of poverty trap. And developing country, if that is very important for the income growth, developing countries certainly should have some kind of advantages. That is so-called advantage of backwardness or lateral advantages. Because in the process of technological innovation, industrial upgrading, improving of institution, they can learn, they can imitate, they can license from the high-income country for those technology or industry or institutional changes. So theoretically, they should grow faster than the high-income country and achieve the convergence to the high-income country. However, most developing countries failed to tap into the potential and to solve the issue of poverty. And the results should be puzzling because the possibility is there, but most of them were not benefited from the possibility. And certainly we would like to see how come most of countries fail, but we do have a few economies that were successful. Are there any lessons that we can learn? So that is the work of the Growth Commission. They look into certain economies after the Second World War, achieve the growth rate of 7% per year or more continuously for 25 years or more. And we know the high-income country, on the average, their growth rate was about 3%. So if a developing country can grow at 7% or more for 25 or more years, certainly they can catch up, they can narrow the income gap. And among these certain economies, there are 5 status facts. They are all open economy. Secondly, they all achieve macro stability. And they also have high rates of saving and investment. And then they also market economy or transit toward a market economy. And then they have proactive government. Those are 5 status facts for the successful economies. And this is a report headed by the Michael Spence. And when he released this report, certainly he gave seminars in many places and met with national leaders in the developing world. And when people ask him, is there a recipe for success? His response was, well, those 5 status facts are ingredients for success, but they are not recipe for success. But we know that if there's no recipe for success, then it's very hard for the developing country to design their policy in order to achieve that success, right? So there's some way we still need to, go further in order to find a way in which we can give some kind of pragmatic advice to the developing country so they can change their path of growth and towards a new direction for their futures. And in the process of the catching up and so on, or structural transformation, investment is very important because no matter technological innovation, industrial upgrading, or improvement in the infrastructure, which are the essential components of the structural transformation, all require investment. And after the Second World War, there were many multilateral and bilateral development institutions like the World Bank or Regional Development Bank. Those are multilateral, or bilateral development institutions like DFID. They provide funding to support the developing world. And since investment is important, so if you have more funding, theoretically, they should be able to contribute to their structural transformation in terms of technological innovation, industrial upgrading, improvement of the infrastructure. But so far, the results show the performance of the developing world are still far away from what we hope to achieve. And so is there a way to improve the development assistance so they can have more resources and achieve their goal of modernization, industrialization, and reducing poverty? And we have so much effort, but we did not achieve the goal. Why? And for that, I think Keynes is right. It is ideas. not vested interest, which are dangerous for good or evil. The reason why we put so much effort, but so far we are not able to achieve the goal, I think because of most people's effort are guided by ideas. And if the ideas are not appropriate, even if you have a lot of effort, then you cannot achieve the goal. And what are the ideas that we have to guide the development effort in the developing country as well as the multilateral development institution? For that, we need to look into the prevailing or the mainstream development ideas. And we know that development economics is a new subdiscipline of modern economics, which emerged after the Second World War to guide the development effort in the developing country when they gain political independence. And the first edition of development economics is structuralism. At that time, the idea was to advise the developing country to build up large-scale modern industries in order to raise their productivity and to catch up. And at that time, the perception of the developing country, they could not have this kind of modern industry was because of market values. And so the advice was for the developing country to mobilize the resources directly by the state in order to build up the large-scale modern industries in a strategy called import substitution strategies. And I think the intention was good, but the result was poor. Very often, after those kind of projects were built up, they became wild elephant, and the economy started to be stagnant and hit by crises all the time. And so by the time of the late 1970s, 1980s, the perception about the reason why the developing country did not do well was because they did not have modern market, well-functioning market institution as in a high-income country. And the idea was the neoliberalism, and the policy prescription was to implement the marketization, privatization, stabilization simultaneously in order to build up the well-functioning market institution in the developing world to overcome the government failures. And again, the aspiration, the intention was good, but the result was poor because after implement this kind of Washington consensus reform, most developing countries, their economy declined sharply, and then stagnant, hit by crises, and the average annual growth rate in the developing country was actually lower than the average annual growth rate in the 1960s, 1970s. And the frequencies of the crisis were even higher compared to the previous period. During this period of time, there were a few successful economies. First was the East Asian economies, as I mentioned, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Japan. In the 1950s, 1960s, they grew very dynamically, and they became newly industrialized economies. And if you look into their approach did not follow the main ideas in the 1950s, 1960s. Instead of trying to build up large-scale modern industries in order to close the gap with high-income countries, they started with traditional, small-scale, labor-intensive industries. At that time, this approach was considered as a wrong approach, but they were successful. And in the 1980s, 1990s, during the period of transition, a few economies were successful, like China, Vietnam, Laos, and actually Mauritius in Africa in 1970s. They all adopt an approach for the transition from the government-led growth to the market-oriented economies by some kind of gradual, piecemeal, dual-track approach, instead of the structural RP advocated by the Washington Consensus. And at that time, those kind of dual-track piecemeal approach was considered as the worst possible approach. But up to now, they were the only group of economy which achieved stability and dynamic economic growth during the period of transition. And they all have, so so from this result, we can see country follow the mainstream ideals. Certainly, the intention was good, and the argument seemed to be convincing, but the result were poor. And a few countries, a few economies, they were successful, but they adopted an approach which was considered as wrong approach, according to the prevailing main ideas in the global development community. So we need to have a rethinking. And I propose a way of rethinking called the new structural economics. In the new structural economics, I advocate the use of neoclassic approach to study the nature of modern economic development. The nature of modern economic development, as I just described, it was a process of continuous technological innovation, structural transformation in terms of industrial structure, hard infrastructure, and institution. And I'd like to use the neoclassic approach to study the determinants of this kind of structural transformation, as well as the impact of this kind of structural transformation. By convention, I should refer this type of approach as structural economics, because if we apply neoclassic approach to study agriculture, then we refer that as agricultural economics. To study finance, then we refer that as financial economics. Then I applied neoclassic approach to study structure and structural transformation. I should refer this type of study as structural economics. But how come I put a new there? Because there was structuralism in the 1950s, 1960s. And to distinguish my approach from structuralism, I refer my approach as new structural economics. Just like Douglas North, in the 1960s, he started to advocate the use of neoclassical approach to study institution and institutional transformation. Then he should refer his approach as institutional economics. But there was an institutional school in the US as turn of the 20th century. So to distinguish his approach from the institutional school, he referred his approach, new institutional economics. So that's in the same spirit. Then what is the main idea of the new structural economics? My main hypothesis is that economic structure, both technology, industry, hard infrastructure, and institutions are endogenous. Endogenous to what? Endogenous to the endowment structure in a country at any specific time. We know that what we refer industry endowments are capital, labor, and natural resources. And they are given at any country at any given time, but they are changeable over time. And the endowments are actually the total budget of a country at any specific time. And for a country at different stage of development, certainly the relative abundance of their endowments will be different. High-income country, they are relatively abundant in capital, and a developing country, they are relatively abundant in either labor force or natural resources. And this kind of relative abundance certainly will determine the relative factor cost of production. And this kind of relative abundance will determine the competitive advantages of a country at any specific time. If your industries and technology are consistent with your competitive advantages determined by your factor endowments, your factor cost of production will be lowest. And if your factor cost of production is lowest, then those kind of industrial structure should be considered as the optimal industrial structure in the economy. Certainly, what we concern is not a static allocation of resources. What we concern is a dynamic economic growth in income, and which should be supported by dynamic changes in the structure. And if we want to reach high income, certainly we need to have a high level of productivity. And if we want to have high level of productivity, certainly we need to have a more capital intensive type of technology and industries. But since the technology and industry are endogenous to the endowment structure, so if you want to move up to more capital intensive industry, then you should increase your availability of capital per workers in order to make that happen. And if you can have more capital to every workers, you can move up to the more capital-intensive industry. But certainly, you also need to simultaneously improve the hard infrastructure and institution to reduce transaction costs. That's the ideas behind the new structural economics. And so when we say a country is trapped in low-income status or trapped in the middle-income status, that means what? They cannot have a dynamic structural transformation to raise their available productivity higher than the high-income country. Then they will be trapped in the low-income or in the middle-income status for a long time. So the income trap actually reflects the inability to have a dynamic structural transformation. But how to make that happen? How to make the dynamic economic growth happen? Well, since the industrial structure is a reflection of your endowment structure, and if you want to move up to the income ladders, you need to improve your labor productivity. But if you want to improve your labor productivities, you need to make the capital more available. And how to make the capital more available? And the idea from the simple analysis of the new structural economics is to follow your competitive advantages, determined by your endowment structure would be the best way. Because if you follow your competitive advantages, your factor cost of production will be lowest. And with adequate hard and soft institutions, then you will be most competitive. If you're most competitive, you can generate the largest possible profit or economic surplus, and you can have more to save. And also, it's easy to prove. If your investment is consistent with your competitive advantages, the return to capital will be the largest. And under that kind of situation, you have more to save, and you have the highest incentive to save. Certainly, your capital will increase the fastest way. And once your capital increase, then you can upgrade your industry and technology. And for a developing country, in this process, they can benefit from the advantage of backwardness. They can grow faster than a high-income country. And to follow the competitive advantages is a way to choose your technology and industry. It's a concept understandable only to economists. How to make that a spontaneous behavior of the entrepreneur? Then you need to have an institution. That the institution is that your relative factor prices should reflect your relative abundances of your factor endowments. And the only way to get those kind of prices is through the competitive market. So if you want to follow your competitive advantages, the precondition is to have a competitive markets. And if market is so important, does the state play some role? Actually, the state is also very important, because economic development is not a process of static allocation of resources. It's a process of continuous improvement in technology, upgrading the industry, as well as improvement in hard infrastructure and institution. And in this process, you need to have a first mover. And you need to compensate for the externality created by the first mover. But you also need to coordinate the changes in infrastructure and institution in order to reduce transaction costs to make the industry can be competitive. And only state can compensate for the externality and provide the coordination in the improvement of hard infrastructure and institution. So that means what? You also need to have a facilitation state to make that happen. And development assistance will be conducive to the development success. If it increases a facilitation state's resources and a capability to support structural transformation. That is the key to make a development assistance to be effective. And I mentioned that Michael Spence, when he launched his report, he often said there was no recipe for success. You have ingredients for success, but there are no recipe for success. But from the new structural economics point of view, there's a recipe for development success. That is to follow your competitive advantages in the structural transformation process. But if you want to follow the comparative advantages, you need to have two preconditions. One is market economy, in order to provide the right price signals. And the second one is to have a facilitation state in order to overcome the issue of externality and also coordination. And those are the conditions number 4 and 5 in the Growth Commission report's status facts. And if you follow your comparative advantages, certainly you will be an open economy. You produce whatever you're good at and export that. And you import whatever you're not good at. And that will be an open economy. So that is the condition number 1 of the status facts. And if you follow your comparative advantages, you will be most competitive. So you are not going to, you are going to, as strong as possible economy. You are unlikely to have a homegrown crisis. And if you are hit by external shocks, you will be in the best position to have counter-cyclical intervention. So under that kind of situation, certainly you are going to have better performance in macro stability. That's condition number 2. And also, if you follow your comparative advantages, I already argued, you are going to have largest possible accumulation of capital because you are going to have, more profit, more revenue, the more to save, and certainly you will also have the highest incentive to save. So that's the condition number 3. So in fact, there's a recipe for development success. That is to follow the competitive advantages in the process of structural transformation. And from this, we can also understand how come the previous ideas of development did not work. For example, structuralism. The intention was good, to help the country to have a structural transformation in order to develop modern, large-scale industries. But the issue is that they went against the competitive advantage of a developing country. Large-scale modern industry was very capital-intensive. But a developing country, in the early stage, they are poor agrarian economies. So they did not have the competitive advantage in those kind of modern sectors. And as a result, firms in those kind of advanced sectors were not viable in an open competitive market unless the government gave subsidies and protection to those non-viable firms. Otherwise, those kind of industry cannot exist. So, in fact, the so-called market value as described by the structuralism was not a market value at all. It was because of those kind of sector went against their competitive advantages, and a firm could not survive without protection and subsidies. And without government protection and subsidy, certainly you will not see the firm enters into those kind of sectors. But under the guidance of structuralism, the government would have to, provide subsidies and protections. And those kind of subsidy protection in general is were carried out in the way of all kind of government intervention and restoration. And the intervention and restoration create rent and rent seeking. So you are going to have the misallocation of resources as well as the corruption, all those kind of issues. And also, development assistance in the 1950s, 1960s did not work because at the time, development assistance were used as a way to support the developing country to realize those kind of ambitious goals, to build up large-scale modern industry, but most of them became quite irrelevant. So you spend a lot of money, it did not work. And then how come Washington Consensus also failed? Well, Washington Consensus did not recognize a lot of distortions in the past were endogenous to the need of protection those kind of large-scale modern industries. And so if we remove all the distortions simultaneously, what would happen? Those kind of industries would go bankrupt, create a huge number of unemployment and social political instabilities. Under the kind of situation, certainly you cannot grow your economy. And development assistance at that time did not work. Was because the development assistance at that time were used to support the developing country to carry out the so-called structural adjustment, to help the government at that time to remove all those kind of distortion in order to build up a well-functioning market economy. But they did not recognize if you did not have those kind of support to the older sectors, they are going to have the issue of bankrupt and social political instability. So that's the reason why it did not work. And also, the Washington Consensus did not work because they opposed the government to use proactive intervention support for the structural transformation in terms of compensate for the first movers, in terms of the necessary coordination in the improvement of the infrastructure and so on. And this can also say how come the dual track piecemeal approach perform better? Because they are more pragmatic. They provide transitory protection and subsidy to the old sector to maintain stabilities. But the government actively facilitation the entry to the new sectors by improving the infrastructure institution in a pragmatic way. And so they can achieve stability and dynamic growth simultaneously. Well, with these kind of ideas, we look beyond the horizon to the future. In the future, we need to understand the world changed a lot. Now, with China and the BRIC country, they contribute more to the world in terms of development, in terms of saving, in terms of investment. Like before the 1990s, the saving in the developing country and the saving in the high-income country was about the same. But now, the developing country, they contribute much more to the global savings, and especially China. And in terms of investment in the world, before 2000, 80% of the investment in the world came from the high-income country. But by the time of 2030, likely 70% of the investment will be coming from the developing country. High-income country will contribute only 30% of the global investment. And certainly China standing out because China now the second largest economy and contribute to about 30% of global growth every year. And China's saving is about 50% of GDP. So China can contribute more. And with this kind of ideas, in the past, the development assistance were, on the one hand, used in the wrong areas. And the second is, so far, the ODA, the Overseas Development Assistance, according to the DEC, the Development Assistance Commission, is too narrow. They only look at the concessional loan, concessional grant. But if you try to promote development, any fund that are used to support structural transformation, both investment in infrastructure, investment in industries, as long as they improve productivities, they improve the job, they create a job, then they will contribute to the goal of development. So we need to expand the definition of development cooperation instead of focus only on concessional fund. And also, if we compare the development assistance in the past and the development assistance in the futures, in the past, mostly come from the high-income country. And as I mentioned, they are focused on narrowly defined activities. And also, this fund carry with the ideas in the developed country, like to improve the market institution or to build up the same industry as in the high-income country. And also, they untie from trade and comparative advantages. In the future, more and more funds will come in from the developing countries like China, India, and others. They will combine aids, trade, and public and private investment. And secondly, they will carry with their ideas of development based on their experiences. And they will combine more with the trade. And I think this may be more effective in promoting structural transformation in the developing world. And follow these ideas. The developing country may have a good opportunity to have a structural transformation. Because if you look, after the Second World War, a few successful countries or economy to transform from an agrarian economy to modern industrialized economy. In general, they capture one window opportunity. That is global relocation of labor-intensive industry from high-income country to low-income country due to the change of comparative advantages in high-income country. And Japan, then the first dragons, then mainland China in the 1980s, a good example of that. And follow these ideals, China currently with a per capita income of close to $9,000 US. China lost competitive advantage in labor-intensive manufacturing. And China will release huge opportunity for that because China is such a large country, and the labor-intensive industry in China, currently employ about 85 million workers. And those kind of jobs will be relocated to other developing countries within 10 years. But how to capture that opportunity? That is the book, Between the Odds. You need to be pragmatic. Developing countries today, certainly, they don't have good infrastructure. They don't have good institutions. Their business environment may be poor. Traditionally, the idea was to improve the infrastructure for the whole nation, improve business environment for the whole nation, and improve the institution for the whole nation. Then things will happen spontaneously. But first, in the past, it did not bring that result. And secondly, developing country cannot wait. So under this, if the government use a pragmatic way, to improve infrastructure, business environment, to have proactive investment promotion, then even a country with very poor overall infrastructure and institution, a country can jumpstart their industrialization. And one good example is Ethiopia. When I started to promote this idea, no one really believed that Ethiopia, another country with very poor infrastructure and institution, can be the manufacturing floor for the global market. But if you come to Africa today, they are the most dynamically growing country in terms of industrialization, in terms of attracting foreign direct investment, and in terms of job expansion in the manufacturing sectors. And not only in Rwanda, in Ethiopia. Rwanda is another example. If you use this kind of very pragmatic approach to create enclave, like a special economic zone and industrial parks, within a zone, you have good enough infrastructure, and to make business simple by one-stop services, and a proactive investment promotion. Even another country like Rwanda can be the manufacturing floor for the global market to capture this opportunity of the structural transformation and creating jobs, completing the transformation from agrarian economy to modern industrial economy. And if the global development assistance are using to support this kind of pragmatic approach, then the job released from China will be sufficient to help African countries and many other developing countries to complete their structural transformation and closing the gap with the developed country. Thank you very much.
Justin, thank you very much. It's been really, really helpful, great lecture, and also some practical examples at the end. And I think we'll probably want to talk a little bit more on those practical examples of your theoretical framework. But before we do that, let me just pass the microphone to Melinda for her comments.
Thank you very much, Dirk, and thank you, Professor Lin. That was fascinating and insightful. And I'm going to just spend a few minutes doing three things. Firstly, talking about why we agree with Professor Lin's central proposition, particularly around the narrative of going beyond aid, and also this important focus on structural transformation as the route to sustained growth. Secondly, I'm going to talk about what DFID is doing about it in practical terms as a bilateral development agency and as part of HMG. And thirdly, and by way of introducing a discussion, I hope, I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that we face as a bilateral donor that we've found so far on our journey to support structural transformation. So, the first point then, why we agree. I think there are three key points as to why we agree with Professor Lin's central thesis about the importance of structural transformation as the route to sustained exit from poverty and sustained growth. The first is unequivocally, as Professor Lin alluded to, the evidence points to it. He spoke about the Michael Spence Growth Commission and the work around that, which showed that in order to eradicate poverty, what we really need is high and sustained levels of growth in order to raise incomes, in order to solve the poverty trap, in order to help countries get on that path to higher productivity and to higher growth. So clearly the evidence is unequivocal there. The second reason is that I think particularly from DFID's point of view, we find that to achieve that objective, conventional approaches don't work as well as they really need to. And by conventional approaches, what I mean there is, the traditional approach to things like enabling environment reform, legislative reform, technical assistance, market-focused M4P type approaches, although each in turn make perfect sense in terms of the broader context, as a set of ingredients, they don't really establish that transformational shift that you need in order for economies and governments to think coherently about what is it going to take to help our country move itself onto that high and sustained growth path. So the conventional tools that DFID has used in the past in particular, we haven't found has really solved that problem. And the third, and this is very personal to me as someone who is involved in the post-2015 or the post-2015 development agenda, or the SDGs as they're now called, was the very powerful, uniquely powerful voice of the low-income countries arguing for just this. This wasn't a narrative exclusively about finishing the job on the MDGs. This was very powerfully a narrative about the importance that they attached over the next 15 years to industrialization, to structural transformation, and their asks of the international community to support them on that journey around infrastructure, urbanization, cities, technology transfer, energy, all the key ingredients for growth that they wanted to see. And it wasn't only an aid story either. I have colleagues in the room who work with me closely on this will remember the importance they attach to a modern development finance landscape in that regard. So those are the reasons I think we agree with Professor Lin about the importance of structural transformation. In terms of what DFID is doing about it, and I think the point to make here is that we are increasingly convinced that smart industrial policy, with a focus on building high-value sectors, is the place to focus. And by smart, what we mean there is a broad and coherent emphasis to unlocking the binding constraints to growth and productivity, whether this be at the level of infrastructure or urbanisation or skills and labour market development or the financial sector. It's clear that all those key ingredients need to be considered together in a way that's tailored to context. And we're also increasingly, we've always been convinced, but it's worth re-emphasising the important role of FDI and the tradable sector, as where some of those productivity leaps are most likely to take place. So in terms of what DFID is practically doing about it then, the economic development strategy that we published early this year is our way of pulling together a consolidated narrative and statement of intent about how we will focus going forward on supporting transformational growth. And there are really three key elements to that. The first is the diagnostics tool that we've used in DFID to help us work through the country programme lens and the country relationship with government lens and partnerships to really get to the bottom of what are the binding constraints to growth, both at the sector level but also the institutional level, and build on that to have a bottom-up story for what are the things that we should be prioritising. The second key element of our strategy are new programmes. So we've brought forward a range of large new programmes centrally in Whitehall, but that we're working on jointly with many country offices that really focus on tackling some of these binding constraints specifically. And just to mention a handful of those, we are working closely with a colleague of Professor Lin's, actually Helen High, on an Invest Africa programme, which is specifically about looking at ways to bring support the manufacturing base in sub-Saharan Africa, but also thinking more coherently about how that forms part of industrial policy with the governments that we're working with. Other programmes include urbanisation in cities and infrastructure, financial sector deepening, commercial agriculture and productivity in the agriculture sector. And of course, this builds on a range of programmes that DFID already has at country level with a view to providing providing greater coherence to those as a collective and thinking about how we can work together on a coherent results envelope across all of those sectors. Alongside this, we continue to work on those traditional tools I was talking about, so the enabling environment reform, regulatory reform. We have a new programme, a new body of work now on domestic resource mobilisation and tax policy in particular. And of course, there is a critical role for evidence in all of this. So many of you will be familiar with the International Growth Centre that we support at the London School of Economics, and also support to economic transformation that we work on with Dirk at ODI. It's absolutely clear that the evidence on this, it's not a done deal. We need to continue researching, we need to continue looking at the key elements, we need to continue forward thinking and providing forward thinking policy-focused, cutting-edge research to governments to help them really establish that smart industrial policy that I was talking about. So that's what we're doing about it. I think the third element, and by way of segueing into a discussion then, is some of the practical things, some of the practical challenges that we find as a bilateral development agency as we go forward and try and establish our name in this area, if you will, but really practically do something about it in a way that's going to, impact lives, essentially, but also not fall foul quickly to the complex political economies in the countries in which we work. So three, I'm sure that you have many, but I'll just throw three out there. I think the first is, what's very clear is that many of these countries already are undergoing some sort of transformation, but it's not the sort of transformation that Professor Lin was speaking about. It's more of a service sector-based transformation. And I'm sure many of you will have seen and read the article in The Economist a couple of weeks ago about why Africa's development model puzzles economists, which spoke specifically to this point. Now, what's clear is that the job creation momentum won't be built and sustained in that sector, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, the job creation challenge is huge in order to absorb the number of unemployed youth that demographic projections predict are going to exist over the coming years. But what's also clear is that we can't ignore it, and I think this speaks to Professor Lin's point about the importance of being tailored to context, because we need to find a way of building on that dynamism and that productivity and that structural shift that's already happening. Whether that's part of the urbanisation phenomenon, where it's particularly concentrated, or more broadly as part of a smart industrial policy. And there's a real question as to how we do that successfully, I think. The second challenge, which we certainly feel very strongly as a government, as a bilateral agency and as a government who've committed to the leave no one behind principle of the SDGs, is how do we do this in a way that stimulates growth paths that are equitable and where the benefits flow widely across economies where inequality is already high. I think we're acutely conscious of the risk of reinforcing rent seeking, in particular with some of the firms in which we talk about working with. I think we're also very conscious of the risk of consolidating sector dominance and the push and pull between opening up sectors and reinforcing elite interests within those sectors is something that I think we still need to work on very carefully as part of our programme approach. And the ICAR review recently on DFID's approach to the inclusive growth diagnostics picked up our work on governance as something that we need to focus on much more strongly going forward. And then the third challenge, I think, is, a country's optimal growth path is ultimately something which requires political vision and patience, and that strong commitment to tackle elite and vested interests and open sectors up to competition, as Professor Lin was talking about. And I think there is a unique challenge there around how we support wide political consensus for what is effectively a long-term structural process in a way that creates consensus right across society, in a way that really builds momentum behind structural reforms. So those are my three main challenges. The fourth one, I know this is contested, but my question to you is, are we running out of time? Because the window for opportunity for countries to follow this sort of growth path is rapidly closing, say many. And certainly the onset of automation in many of the industries that we're speaking about is increasingly a sort of undercurrent to this narrative around the importance of structural transformation. So what strategies can industrial policy adopt to address this in a way that helps us really think about where the industries we're talking about are going to be in 5-10 years' time? So those are my challenges. Thank you again, and I look forward to a good discussion.
Thank you, Melinda. That's been very helpful as well. Before we go to the audience, maybe just wanted to pick up on these some of these challenges, which is also so the last two maybe sort of about the political vision that's needed. So you've explained in very eloquent terms the approach, the new structural economics approach, and then you've put it into practice, and you've supported the government of Ethiopia, you've supported the government of Rwanda. You're also, I know you've done work in Nigeria, and I think you mentioned Benin, and I think the book, maybe it's more Celestine that talked about it, but Tanzania has come up with many of the strategies that are there. So what are the sort of the challenges that you see? So I think, you're very positive about it, that every country can achieve it. Do you feel that that some countries are grasping the window of opportunity, whilst others aren't. And what then do you do if they don't grasp it?
I think that one of the main challenges is that to have a vision and keep focus. Because in a country, certainly they faces all kind of challenges, and also had advice from all different, directions. And under that kind of situation, to make this idea works, it's very important to have quick wins. Once you have quick win, it's easier to mobilize the consensus in the country. But to have a quick wins, it's very important to have a leadership. The head of state should be convinced and should be ready to be behind the new directional changes. Because although, to create a special economic zone and to have one-stop services and to have incentive packages to attract foreign direct investment as a jumping pad for, utilize the domestic comparative advantages and to reach global market, and as a demonstration for the local firm to follow. The idea is not so hard to understand. But if you go to a country, they have the bureaucrats, and they follow the oral practices. And if you want to make those kind of changes, the bureaucrats, they may not fully understand. And they will still behave in a traditional way of doing business. And under the kind of situation, those kind of programs will be there and did not have any work. One example, we know that increasingly now many governments, they understand it's impossible to improve the infrastructure for the whole nation. But so special economic zone would be a good way to create enclave for this kind of structural transformation. But if you go to the developing country, including those in Africa, you find most of special economic zone do not work. And the main reason is that although they have the vision, but they don't put infrastructure in the special economic zone. It's just a name. Okay, in some cases, they put infrastructure in the special economic zone, but they put that in a wrong location. Very often in the hometown of the national leaders, but they do not have any economic justification. Or they also put the special economic zone in right location and with sufficient infrastructure, but sometimes they are too ambitious. They want to attract high-tech industry, but they don't have any comparative advantage in high-tech industries. So, the idea is right and not so hard to understand, but the implementation now become a bottlenecks. So it's very important to have a leadership and also to see through the whole implementation until they create quick wins in order to really mobilize the consensus and direction for the country.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess some countries are better at implementing this, and I think you should also read Sonia Hock's blog on the Habasa Industrial Park that we visited 2 months ago, which is a fascinating example of how the Ethiopian government has actually sort of pursued this idea and built the park in about 8 months, wasn't it?
In 10 months.
Yeah, exactly.
And they can create 50,000 jobs in about 3 years.
Yeah.